Hey folks, welcome to your weekly video. So this week, let's look at the Canvas calendar, the Canvas home page. So under this week, you have your final edited essay 3 due, right? This is the one where you chose the topic of music diplomacy or music and climate change. So I just finished feedback. So you should have a lot of rich feedback. Just go to your paper, click view feedback, and you should see like 10 to 20 little bubbles that I've sort of pinned to your paper. I wanted to use that format this time. So check that out and use that to revise, use peer review to revise, and get that in by Sunday night. So that's think of that as your soft target deadline. Okay, so that's the top of this week. Then I'd like you to watch this really interesting video. So click on this link and you'll see a video about local meteorologists in Arizona who, and also in other parts of the country, who use their platform as sort of like trusted meteorologists to talk about climate change. They'll sort of give like the 50 or 100 year rain cycles or weather extremes, right? They'll put it into like this larger context. So it's really interesting how they're doing this this work around climate change, and that's an example this week of for our final essay, right? We're starting to get into our final essay now, and for our final essay, you need to narrow your topic. And so for final essay 4, you get to pick your topic, right? What do you want to write about? We've been writing about music for the last month. So what do you want to write about for this paper? And I'm going to give you an example, right? You don't have to write about climate change meteorology at all. But this is my example this week of how to narrow a topic. So for example, let's say you choose climate change. What are you going to say about climate change? That's way too big of a topic. It's too general. You can't make an arguable claim, right, about a big generality. You have to have a narrow claim. You can prove a narrow claim. You can't prove a generality, right? Climate change, we need to do something about it. Yeah, we know that, right? So I show you how to do this. So watch that video. And then I give you this. This was like my first PowerPoint ever. I did this like 10 years ago, and I still use this the design, right? The words change, but the design is the same. So pick a topic, right? Whatever you want to write about: climate change, design, business, modified cars, the World Cup, whatever, right? Whatever you want to write about. But you have to narrow all of these categories that we're about to look at, and you have to make a unique contribution to that topic, right? So that means you really have to narrow, right? You can't, what are you going to say about climate change, right? That hasn't been said. What are you going to say about sports, right? That hasn't been said. So let's look at how you can do this. So you need to narrow the who, what, where, when, why, and how of your topic. So let me show you. I'll start with the what, right? What do I want to write about? What's my topic? Climate change, right? I want to write about climate change. That's too huge. It's too broad. I can't add anything to that conversation, right? So I need to make it narrower, okay? I need to break it down. So I need to start adding other concepts, other keywords, different ways of thinking about climate change, different approaches, right? So I could start with, okay, what do I want to talk about? I want to talk about climate change solutions. Okay, getting a little more narrow. What type of climate change solution, Johnny? Right? So I'm like, okay, advocating, persuading, having local scientists, but local scientists a lot of them aren't listened to, or national scientists aren't listened to. So I start narrowing to, the type of way of persuading about climate change, and I get to this narrower what, right? Let's talk about meteorologists, right, who can educate and advocate about climate change. Okay, so suddenly my what is much more narrow. I'm not talking about climate change anymore. It's much more narrow, right? Meteorologists educating the public about climate change, right? So I've got a much more narrowed what, okay? And you'll watch the video on these climate change meteorologists. They're fascinating, and they they miss a few things, right? I watched it a few times, and I started noticing, like, okay, they're talking about nightly news meteorology, right? And I'm like, okay, I don't know a lot about meteorology, but I looked it up, and there's like 20 different types of meteorology, right? And they don't talk about that in this video, right? In this source. So I looked up these different types of meteorology, and I'm like, okay, maybe this is a place I could add something new, right? They talk about sort of general weather meteorology, but there's also environmental, there's agricultural meteorology, there's aviation meteorology, there's maritime, there's military, right? So I was like, okay, I could say something about this. I could add something new about this, right? Um, so I could add on to this argument of these, local weather um, uh, forecasters talking about and educating, people in the suburbs about climate change to like, okay, what about if military meteorologists, what if they started talking about climate change for a military audience? Right now, I'm adding something new, right? That is not said in our source for this week, right? This is me adding something new, right? Or agricultural meteorology, right? People who have farms are really tuned in to agricultural meteorology. What if they started talking about climate change affecting crops, right? So you could get a lot of rural Americans like, oh, suddenly hearing about climate change in a different way. Um, or maritime, right? This is Navy or other fleets, or aviation, right? Like, what if your pilot, came across the the AP system, and you're on American flight, 122 to San Francisco, and they started talking about, yeah, the winds are picking up. We've noticed some differences in weather over the last 10 years, right? That would be really startling, I think, to a lot of passengers. So I want to add that, right? None of this is talked about. They only talk about general weather meteorology from your local meteorologist. Okay, so then I've narrowed my what. Now I want to narrow my why, right? So think like a journalist, right? Like, why should we use meteorology to educate about climate change? Why is this important? Who thinks that, right? So start asking general why questions. And I'm like, okay, why should meteorologists be the ones educating us about climate change rather than, national scientists or global figures? And we just see that a lot of people don't trust global figures or national scientists, but they trust their local weatherman or their local weatherwoman or their non-binary weather person. They trust that person, right? That they see every night on TV, right? They're like a little celebrity in their town, right? Like, I know who our local weather person is. They are kind of like a celebrity in Seattle. So I think that's an interesting why, right? And so I answer that question, right? They have tremendous reach. They're these trusted local sources. Like, my dad loves, his local weather person. Like, my mom gets really upset. He loves this local person. So, right, why? Right, why should meteorologists do this? So I've narrowed my why, and then I want to get into my who. Right, who's watching this local weather? Right, who could be affected by learning about climate changes through the weather report? Right, who could learn about that? And I had to look this up, right, folks? You're gonna have to look stuff up. So our source this week doesn't talk about it. It just says, who people watching local news are learning about climate change. It doesn't go into the who. I'm narrowing the who. So I look up, most people who watch local weather news are 50 to 64 years old, right? That's the main crop. That's the main age. And younger people too, but the main audience is 50 to 64. That's like the lion's share. I'm like, okay, right? That helps me narrow my who. And so younger generations aren't really watching local meteorologists, right? Other people. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Can I narrow that, right? So I want to narrow on young people, right? How do we reach young people and put them, get them watching a live weather person, right? Because if you're just looking at your phone, if you're looking at, weather.com on your phone and those preset weather apps, you're not getting a real person talking to you about climate change, right? Interpreting, right? Analyzing, giving you a new nightly perspective. So I think that's really interesting about who is receiving this data from live weather reporting. right? So I want to focus on young people, right? When, right? When are we talking about? When does this happen? Well, it's usually like nightly news. When did meteorologists start reporting on climate change, right? So just start asking when questions, right? When can we change this? When does this happen? When does this affect people the most? I can get a lot out of the when. I can get a lot out of where, right? Where are these local meteorologists working, right? They're local. They're hitting like a suburban audience. They're hitting rural TV, urban centers, right? I could go a broader where. I could go in, oh, does this phenomenon happen in Mexico, right? Do you have local meteorologists talking about climate change in Mexico City or Guatemala City or Vancouver or Brasilia, right? So that would be a great paper topic, right? That's not explored or talked about in that source this week, right? So I could do a paper of comparison and contrast, right? Let me compare sort of two international forecasters and see how they talk about climate change or don't, right? Is this an American phenomenon? Are other countries? My hypothesis is that other countries are doing this, and maybe we learn from them, right? I think we learn from like Mexican weather forecasters, like how to like broach climate change. But that's my where. I'm narrowing all of these categories: who, what, where, when, why, and how. Right? Um, you know, and then the how. Like, how is this affecting people? How is this affecting young people? How is this affecting older viewers? So that is your main work this week, is to pick a topic, right? What do you want to write about for your final paper? And then narrow the who, what, where, when, why, and how to get to a place where you can find something to add, right? To get to a place where you can find something, an original angle, an original, oh, they didn't mention this one thing, or they missed this thing, or I want to add this thing based on my experience, right? Because I watch like weather news when I'm at my parents' house, and then when I'm not, I'm looking at my phone app. So I sort of have two experiences. So I'm like, okay, right? Sort of seeing two different worlds there led me to this topic. Okay, so that is your main mastery skill this week. So if you click on discussion, right, it's going to walk you through narrowing your topic, right? And I just ask you to just give all that input right here, right? So choose a topic. Step 1, write that down in the discussion. Step 2, narrow all of your who, what, where, when, why, or how, right? Just plug it in. It can be sort of like a data dump. It could be in complete sentences, however you want to do that. But I need to see that all of those things narrowed. Follow step 3, step 4, and then I start looking at what sources, right, could you use, right, to help you with this new narrowed topic, right? So just go through all of that. Think of this as like a brainstorming discussion, right, to get you to a claim for this final paper, right, on a topic that you're passionate on a topic that you love, on a topic that you want to learn more about, right? Because trust me, folks, in narrowing your topic like I just did with climate change, I started with my general abstract, what am I going to say about climate change? I got to a really unique and original place. That's where you need to get to this week, right? That's the big lesson here, is can you start with this big general abstraction, right? I want to write about cars. I want to write about sports, right? Like, okay, I want to write about dog health. Okay. And can you narrow that down? Okay, I want to write about dog health. Well, what kind of dog health? What dogs eat, right? What are we feeding them? Okay. Should we home make their food? Then I do more research. Yeah. Americans home cooked dog food, right? They ate off of our plates until like the 60s, right? 1960s. And then we had like the rise of, Purina and like these large dog food companies and marketing that convinced us that we have to like buy kibble for our pet, right? So like, see how I'm narrowing? So you're also going to have to do some research, right? Your research will help you narrow as well. But you need to get to a unique angle, right, through narrowing. That is your major task this week. And then you have a few little tiny readings on narrowing if that helps. Okay, as always, email me if you have any questions. I am always available. Thank you, folks. I feel like this one's going to be a little long.